I want to take the discussion on a different avenue, if I can, and kind of discuss the thing or the topic that the Christians really love to bring up when Muslims confront them with these inconsistencies and different aspects of the story. They usually say that the majority of scholars, regardless of what Muslims say, the majority of historians, they basically support and agree to Jesus being crucified, and Christians themselves love to raise this fact. However, I want to kind of get your opinion on this, Brother Aqil. Can Christians be sure, if there was a crucifixion in reality, if Jesus was put on the cross, can Christians be sure that Jesus died if he was truly on the cross? Christian scholars and non-Christian scholars alike, amongst the historians, say that a crucifixion took place and that Jesus was the one crucified. So if we were to take this information, which in reality wouldn't contradict the Quranic story, as the Quran mentions that they have not crucified the Messiah, nor did they kill him. So it wouldn't contradict the Quranic story if Jesus was placed on the cross but didn't die. Within your reading of the biblical text, in particular the New Testament, can a reader come away with the idea that people at that time, all the way up into our time, can be sure that the man Jesus, if he were put on the cross, actually died?
Bismillah. This is a good question, and I think that we have to understand the reality of the Gospels itself and its historical narrative as it relates to crucifixion, as well as history redacting the Christian narrative to be an issue of fact. So you have 4 gospel writers that narrates a death by crucifixion to a man named Jesus in the 1st century. And this is very clear from the Bible itself. But my contention is that, and this is supported by biblical scholarship that look at the event and things in the Bible, that Christianity is a product of a theology that was it promoted and concocted a story to suffice a theology that they wanted to promote. Not that this is actually history and we are basing the theology off of historical narration. And I'll give you an example. The idea that the crucifixion took place with Jesus, peace be upon him, and many historical or historians narrate this to be a fact about Jesus. How can we ascertain this to be a fact about Jesus when we are undermining by default the fact that the gospel narratives are not reliable? If we don't know who wrote the first gospels as they came into existence, when they were actually written, by who, then how can we accept these narrations to be authentic and reliable? And history is only repeating, for the most part, what Christians have presented about the crucifixion in the first place. If you remove the Bible altogether from history with no narration about the crucifixion, then no scholar will mention anything about the crucifixion. So the historians are relying heavily upon the biblical testimony of the fact, but the biblical testimony of the fact itself is unreliable and unverifiable. So we have basically a redaction of something that was promoted from a theology, not from a historical perspective. And this is an example I gave in a previous debate I had with a gentleman by the name of Pastor Angelos, is that if you have something in history that occurred and it was non-factual, but it was promoted to be factual and it became a dominant narrative, 50, 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years later, that dominant narrative becomes a standard. Even though it's afactual, it's non-factual, it becomes history. People believe Christopher Columbus discovered America. We know he didn't discover America. When he got here, people were here. But according to history, he discovered America. So given that reality, we can see that in history, things happen that's not truthful, but they're later on promoted as truth. And I think this is a big contention that we have to deal with.
Right, brother Aqil, you brought up some great issues, and I definitely appreciate you sharing that. I kind of just want to chime in on what you were mentioning in terms of what history says about different events in the past that we cannot verify, and we can only really just go upon what we think happened in the past. I just wanted to kind of put the thoughts out there to our listeners that how many cases of mistaken identity have happened during the past, even within our day and time. Mistaken identity. People have been put to death and executed within the United States because of mistaken identity in terms of crimes. So it would really be a very understandable situation if people mistook someone on the cross for Jesus. And even on top of that, if Jesus were to be put on the cross, and this is actually a historical fact, then how many also at the same time instances do we know of people being assumed as dead and placed in the morgue? This literally happens within our own time. People are assumed as dead, placed in the morgue. Some people are even buried alive because people think they've died and they haven't actually died. So these, like you were saying, brother Aqil, I really appreciate how you put that just because people believe something in the past and spread that around doesn't make it true. It was just something people believed and became widespread. We can never, assume that that's 100% truth. And it's really comes down to just a faith-based belief. So brother Mustafa Ahmed, I want to throw a question at you with regards to Jesus not really seeming in the biblical narrative as though he predicted his own death, even though Christians always like to mention these kinds of descriptions in terms of how he lived his life and how he taught people. When we look at the biblical narrative of the resurrection, and this ties into the crucifixion, the resurrection narrative doesn't really seem like his disciples in particular were expecting him to be resurrected. This kind of inconsistency and very strange aspect of the Bible kind of makes someone wonder. It's just one of those things that I think we can discuss and gain some benefit and some insight on. Did Jesus actually predict his own death and resurrection?
Yeah, I mean, this topic, Brother Aqil he will smash this one. Like I said earlier on, the problem that we have is that this topic about Jesus predicting his death, it was kind of like unknown to the disciples and even the people. They were not aware. So suppose we read Mark chapter 8 verse 31. He said, "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Did you get this? That he was telling them, he's predicting this is what's got to happen, but Peter took him aside and rebuked him. Why did Peter take him aside? Peter knew this is not true. Well, how could there be? You're the Messiah, you can't die. Do you know what I mean? And this is evident even in Gospel of John. The crowd knew that the Messiah will not die, he will live. And so I think this is a really crucial topic where it is predictions that would not have been said by Jesus. The Jews of that time, even Peter, suppose we even took it that he was illiterate according to Acts 4:13, the fact that he would have known about this going to a synagogue and etc., and the Jews around him, they would have known that this wouldn't have been true. The Messiah would not have died. So it is a later developed story, just to put a theme inside. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
To make it more happening, more like put this cinematic scene inside of that climax. No, something will happen. He has to die. The scriptures say it. Fulfill it. Yet they cannot show us from the Old Testament scriptures such a fulfillment should even happen. Then it starts ending up going as Jonah 3 days, 3 nights. Even that wouldn't even be fulfilled if we was going to use it. So I really don't take that as anything serious that Christians can and use, because the Old Testament itself is evidence against them. And I think Brother Aqil, if you he'll be able to expand on this even more.
Yeah, absolutely. Brother Akil, we're going to ask you the same question. Did Jesus actually predict his own death?
If you even consider what Mustafa mentioned, Allah bless him, about when Peter rebuked Jesus about his claim of having to die for that, some Christians will try to wash this away by saying, no, Peter was just he was not satisfied with hearing the news of Jesus dying, that it bothered him, and this is why he said that, like, don't talk like this, so to say, and not the fact that he was rebuking him because this was something, a contradiction to the theology of the Old Testament. But given that aside, let's give that argument to the Christians and say, okay, this is Peter's love for Jesus, that he didn't want to hear the fact of him dying. But when we look at the biblical narrative of these gospel testimonies of the crucifixion, and then also the legend of resurrection as well, you find that the disciples had no idea that Jesus was supposed to die, because they were very shocked to see him back on the resurrection. You read, for instance, in the Gospel of Luke, 24:11, it mentions, it says, and their words seemed to them as idle tales. And this is referring to when the women, after they allegedly seen Jesus, they came back and told the disciples. They say that their words seemed as idle tales, and they believed them not. So disciples didn't believe that Jesus was resurrected. We have a whole a terminology, doubtful Thomas, because of one of the disciples didn't believe that Jesus was in fact resurrected. If I tell you tomorrow I'll be at your house at 5 o'clock, and I show up at your house at 5 o'clock, why would you be surprised? Didn't I tell you I was coming? If Jesus said it's a must for me to die, and then I will be raised up 3 days later, why when you see me 3 days later, you're surprised and you don't believe it when people tell you I'm raised up? So it's you can have these statements where allegedly Jesus prophesied his death and resurrection, but when you read the intertextual narrations, it doesn't add up. All the disciples didn't believe. They all had doubts about it. And on top of that, Jesus accompanied some of the disciples for half a day. He even ate with them. They didn't recognize who he was. And then when they recognized who he was, they were afraid. They were shocked. Mary Magdalene, who was very dear to Jesus and very known to Jesus, when she seen him after the legend of resurrection, she didn't recognize who he was. She thought he was a gardener. Why would this be the case if this man is prophesizing his death and resurrection, and then when he resurrected, the people don't recognize him? But they do recognize him, they're afraid of him. They think that he's a ghost, or they say that this is idle tales. What's idle tales? That he died and raised up again? If they believe this is idle tales, that clearly means he never prophesied and mentioned anything about a resurrection.
Just to add that, sorry, Kareem, I just want to say that in John 12:33-34, he said to signify the kind of death he was going to die. The crowd responded, we understand from scripture that the Messiah will live forever. How can you say that the Son of Man will die? Just to say the Son of Man anyway. So even the crowds were aware that, hold on, the Messiah will not die. Where did you get it from? Do you see what I'm trying to say? So to me, it seems a bit like dubious that one thing Jesus is saying, but the Jews around that time, they were not aware that this Messiah would have to die. Do you know what I mean? You see that they're correcting the Old Testament now. They're correcting the Old Testament by saying, no, it does say it, but there's nowhere to be found. So that is a great point, yeah.
And quickly, if I can, I mean, that's a great point as well about the whole idea of the Messiah not dying. But this, I think, is where theology exposes history. That this is a theological fabrication that the Christians promoted, and they're trying to make history conform to that theology. But this is not really historical, because this can't be the case. It's so ahistorical in so many contradictions. Again, another place in the Bible you find in Mark 16:8. And they went out quickly and fled from the grave or the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to them, or any man, for they were afraid. So they, this is something that they seen as to be unaware of. And it goes on in verse 11, when they told the people, the other disciples, and when they heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, they believe not. Why wouldn't you believe me? Why wouldn't you believe these women giving testimony that Jesus has risen again after he said in every single gospel, it is written that the Son of Man must die, be harmed, and then raise up again. So it's clear that someone is not being truthful in his narration. And why would the people not believe in such an event when it was prophesied about Jesus in every single gospel?